Well, welcome to the Big C and Me podcast. My name is Andy Robinson and I'm a leader of LifeSpring Church and the founder of WayMaker International charity and Zambian NGO. I'm also a blogger and you may know me from social or video media as the Big C in Me. In January 2023, I was diagnosed with stage 4 bowel cancer, and as part of that journey I've met some amazing people. Some of them were already good friends, others were people I'd met briefly in the past, and some are new friends that I've made along the way. All of them have been an incredible support to me in different ways, and so I hope sharing my story with you and having them chat on this podcast would also be a support to others who are on a similar journey. This week, I'm going to continue my story as we look at part 2 of my prognosis. You can go back and listen to the previous podcast to catch up, but having had a massive wait for my bowel surgery because of heart complications, the day did eventually arrive. I was told that they were going to try and operate using keyhole surgery, but as the surgeon delicately put it, I'm a big bloke. So keyhole surgery may not be possible, in which case they would have to open me up, resulting in a scar from below my belly button up to the middle of my tummy. I've had several surgeries, so I'm used to having a general anaesthetic, but when I met the anaesthetist before going into theatre on this occasion, I was told that because there's a possibility of them opening me up, that I would not be having the usual general anaesthetic, but an epidural. An epidural is an injection in your back to stop you from feeling pain in parts of your body. It involves putting a needle into your spine and leaving a line from which painkillers are administered to maintain the painlessness and ensure that it remains constant. The thought of an epidural, having a needle pierce my spine, did fill me with some fear, to be honest. It just sounds painful. Fortunately, there was not much time for me to dwell on that fact. As I was wheeled into the anaesthetist's room on a gurney immediately before being taken to theatre, I met a new anaesthetist who explained what was about to happen and how it would be a little painful as she put the needle into my spine. As they got everything ready, they were chatting with me and the inevitable question came, what do you do for a living? I always love these opportunities to open up the conversation and talk about Jesus, and so being in full-time ministry allows you to do that quite easily when asked that question. I explained that I was a Christian and a full-time church minister, which often means resorting to the term vicar to just allow them to understand what it is that I do. Interestingly, the anaesthetist then piped up and said that her tutor and mentor at med school was a Christian too. And she explained to me that he always told her that when preparing for an epidural and moving down the spine, looking for the correct place, God would always give a sign showing the perfect spot. She then kind of sighed, giving me the impression she didn't really believe that too much. But she started feeling down my spine nonetheless, looking for the right spot in my back, when suddenly she said, I don't believe it. There's a small mole exactly where I think I should put the needle. When I came around after the operation, they were testing for the effectiveness of the epidural by running ice over my tummy and legs to see if I could feel it. Strangely, I could feel the sensation on my skin of the ice being moved, but I couldn't tell if it was hot or cold. When the anaesthetist came to see how I was doing, she asked about the ice test, and I told her, and she said, that is totally perfect, exactly how it is supposed to be. To which I responded, I guess God really did give you the perfect spot to put that needle then. For which, to be fair, I did receive a smile and a wink for her as she continued her rounds. The surgery turned out to be a great success, and because it was keyhole and the doctors expected me to be home in 4 or 5 days, and they didn't need to open me up in the end anyway. I was particularly happy because that meant that they didn't have to give me a colostomy either, which I was dreading as a possibility, to be honest. A colostomy is where they create an opening called a stoma in your stomach, and the opening creates a passage from the large intestine to the outside of your body so that poo and gas can leave the body through the stoma instead of passing through the rectum, and it's then collected in a colostomy bag. Knowing that everything had gone well, and particularly no colostomy, was a massive relief to me, but not only to me, but to Hazel, my family, and all the people who were praying for me too. I mentioned earlier that your cancer treatment plan is only ever as good as your last scan, and that's also true of surgery recovery. You're never certain when you'll be home till you're home. And whilst the initial prognosis after the surgery was really good, things took a change for the worse 2 days into my so-called recovery in hospital. I began to run a temperature and feel very unwell indeed. I was very nauseous, which turned out to be an adverse effect to the morphine I was on, but more concerning was the pain in my stomach and abdomen. To aid recovery from bowel surgery, it's important to move about, to get up and walk. So every day the nurses used to get me up and try and get me to walk down the corridor. The first day or so was okay, but as my temperature spiked and the pain in my stomach and abdomen worsened, it became impossible for me to get up. Even sitting in a chair was so uncomfortable. I could only manage it for a few minutes while they changed the sheets on my bed, and then I had to get back into it. Eventually, the doctors became somewhat concerned, and I was sent for an emergency CT scan about 7 or 8 p.m. at night, where it became evident that the bowel resection had not been entirely successful. The tumours had been successfully removed, but the two ends of the bowel had not been joined fully, and so the content of my bowels was leaking into my belly. Not a nice thought, I know. But this was, of course, in causing an infection and needed to be rectified immediately. So at 11 p.m, I was rushed into emergency surgery where they would attempt to fully connect the ends of the bowel that were leaking. Hazel had no idea this was happening. She was in the hospital when I was taken for the CT scan, but went home as we had no idea how long we'd have to wait for the CT. And so I just said, look, go home and get some rest. The nurses did call her around midnight as I was taken into surgery, but it was not able to. She was not able to connect with them because she was asleep, and for some reason her phone never rang, and so she was blissfully unaware until the morning when she picked up a voicemail. The emergency surgery was brutal. I remember being in so much pain in the recovery room. The morphine was not even touching the pain. And to be completely candid, if there was a gun by my bed, I would have used it. No question, I was in that much pain. The morphine was on a constant drip, but I could supplement that by pressing a little button, which would give me a little more. This is, of course, electronically controlled, not allowing me to self-administer more morphine than I was allowed, which basically meant every 5 minutes, 12 times maximum in an hour. However, the recovery nurse explained to me later that the system records how many times I press the button in an hour, and she told me that I pressed it 91 times. Such was the extent of my pain. After being returned to my bed in the ward in the small hours of the morning, the pain was still excruciating, and the nausea as a result of having my bowels handled and the adverse response to the morphine meant I felt like I would be vomiting at any moment. This was a fearful experience because the last thing I wanted to do was be sick, as I knew it would be very painful because of the surgery on my stomach. However, the inevitable happened. The first time I was sick on the bed as the nurse didn't respond to my emergency button fast enough. This vomit was as I would expect. However, I was immediately sick again, and this time it was a black-brown colour, which was very disconcerting. Obviously, the thought of was poo in my stomach and was it in my blood? What was it? What was coming up? I had no idea. But before I could really process those thoughts, I was sick again. And this time it was bright green. If I was concerned at the brown, now I was very worried by this green liquid that I was puking up. After all of this was cleaned up, the nurse explained that this was all quite normal and that she would put an NG tube, neogastric tube, down my throat via my nose, as this would stop me being sick, because it would drain the contents of my stomach through a tube that, as I say, was inserted into my nose. Whilst it stopped me from being sick, seeing out of the corner of your eye bright green liquid coming out of your nose was somewhat disconcerting. When Hazel arrived the following day, I could see the shock on her face. I had been in so much pain the night before and been up all that time occupied with vomiting and NG tubes, and I suppose as a result of the morphine I was not really with it enough for her to ask me how the surgery had gone. I clearly did not look well to Hazel, but it was also, I had so many tubes coming out of me, draining into various bags at the side of my bed. I had a catheter which was collecting my urine. I had the NG tube collecting this green bile from my stomach. I had a surgical drain collecting the fluids coming out of my stomach cavity, which they'd flush with loads of water because of the leak. Hazel had, of course, been briefed by the nurses about the operation before she came into the room, and whilst not really prepared for what she saw, she then had to explain to me that the emergency surgery was not keyhole. They had to open me up below my belly button up to the middle of my tummy, and they also had no choice but to give me a colostomy too, as it was essential the new bowel joint would be able to heal without the risk of further infection. I'm not really sure what I felt in that moment. I was still hooked up to the morphine drip, and so don't really remember the exact moment I discovered that everything we were so pleased and excited by after my first surgery had now been completely taken away. It felt like everything we were hoping and praying and asking God for that He'd initially answered, but now it was all being undone and replaced with everything we didn't want to happen. I was in and out of consciousness for the rest of that day. The exhaustion of the operation, the fatigue of the vomiting, and the effects of the morphine all played their part in me sleeping more than I was awake. Hazel never left my side that day, and later she told me that she was sitting there in tears asking God all these big questions when I woke, looked at her and said, "He's still good, Hayes." And then I went right back to sleep. And I have no recollection of that happening at all. The recovery from this emergency surgery was long and very hard. My 5 days in hospital became 3 weeks, and I have to say that they were some of the hardest days of my life. Every movement you make begins in your core, that is your stomach area, and I had a massive staple, stitches and all sorts holding my stomach together, and the pain of getting up, walking or doing anything was all excruciating. Because of all the tubes and the collection bags I had coming out of me, not to mention the drugs and liquids being put into me via an IV tube, meant that I couldn't get up alone. I could not walk alone or do anything alone. Going to the loo was not a problem, as I had a catheter and a colostomy bag now, but even that was not plain sailing, as the catheter got blocked and so my bladder was not draining. This resulted in loads of additional pain in my stomach area and eventually meant having to have the catheter taken out and me learning to pee while lying in a bed. The things you learn that you hope you would never have to. Through all of this, the supernatural peace of God remained with me. Not once did I question God's goodness to me. I know with all my heart that He is good all the time, and that my circumstances are not a barometer or a reflection of His goodness. The sad fact is that we live in a fallen world where bad things happen to good people, not because God is doing it, but because we have chosen our own way in this world. We have, as a global community, by and large, entirely rejected God. And because he gives us free will, he has not interfered or intervened, thus allowing all of humanity to experience the consequences of that rejection. And all the while, he remains good, willing to meet with us, allowing us to know him and know that the plans that he has for us are good. And he has a purpose for us too. Even though there have been times in all of this, I felt like I was walking through the valley of the shadow of death, as Psalm 23 puts it, I did not fear evil, as I knew he was with me. His supernatural peace had invaded my inner being to the point where I've never doubted his goodness to me. And I'll explain more of that maybe in another podcast. My 3 weeks in the hospital were hard, physically and mentally. But I was rarely bored, to be honest, because my family seemed to be constantly at my bedside. I don't think there was a single day in the whole 3 weeks where I did not have visitors, often multiple visitors, multiple times in a day. Fortunately, I had a private room which I saw as the goodness of God to me, and probably to all of the other patients, as that meant visiting times and rules and volume levels were never enforced. My parents, who are in their 80s, drove from Essex to Sussex every other day to see me for the entire time I was in the hospital. My sister Kathy came almost as often, and even my sister Rachel, who's a school head teacher, would spend several of her Saturdays driving from Cambridgeshire and sitting with me. Being in the hospital for three weeks meant I was the longest serving inmate in the ward. I told you I was competitive, didn't I? So I got to know many of the nurses quite well. One of them, Shelby, was completing her apprenticeship, and she was fascinated by our family. She was so good to me and was always the first to respond when I pressed the buzzer. And she would sit and ask me about my family, my sprightly 80-year-old parents, my sisters, and everyone visiting me. And she was astonished by their loyalty, the volume, which if you didn't know would be a trademark of our family, and the many laughs that were always heard coming out of my room. I had an open door there to talk to her about Jesus, our faith in him, and how there's nothing more important than him, but that family runs a very, very close second. When I eventually left the hospital, Shelby grabbed me and said, I had a baby last year and I want to build a family just like yours. It's not often that I'm speechless, but I was then. Just our family, being ourselves in this very difficult and trying circumstance, spoke to this nurse of the goodness of God. Brilliant. I was discharged a day or two later, but deep down I did not really want to go. Yes, I've been in the hospital for 3 weeks at this point, and I was bored and fed up with being alone in my room when my family wasn't with me. But I couldn't concentrate long enough to read or even watch a movie, and so when people were not about, it was hard. The nights particularly were very long and very boring. And it's often then that you become aware of your pain and discomfort. So on one hand, I wanted to get out and get home, but I still felt so ill. The pain was so bad, and I did not know how I would come to get any kind of painkillers of the level I was getting in the hospital if I was at home. Eventually, they did give me oxycodone instead of morphine, and they gave me that in tablet form to take home. Barely I could walk, maybe 20 yards, and that was with 2 nurses helping me. Even then, I would need a proper lie down and a rest afterwards. I also had a hole in my belly after the surgery. There was some fluid build-up in part of the incision, and so they decided to take out some of the staples holding the wound together so the fluid could be released and infection avoided. The downside was I then had an opened wound that was 3 centimetres wide, 3.5 centimetres long, and 6 centimetres deep. It was still weeping and open, and so the condition of my discharge from hospital was that community nurses would come and visit me at home every other day until the hole had healed and closed up. I was eventually discharged on a Friday with a bag of medicines, including the oxycodone tablets for the pain, and told that the community nurses would come to my home on Monday. My 80-year-old parents collected me, as they have a car that you don't have to get down into. And even they had to push me out of the hospital in a wheelchair, as there was no way I could walk through the long corridors of the hospital to the car park under my own steam. The drive home was so painful. It felt like my dad was seeking out every pothole and bump in the road. And with every bump, I felt so much pain as my insides were being violently shaken, or at least that's how it felt. For the record, Dad was not deliberately driving and looking for every bump and pothole, but my pain meant that I could feel every tiny little bump in the road, however slight it may have been. I must admit that felt like the longest drive home from hospital ever. Being at home was comforting in many ways, but my discomfort meant that every day was an effort. I'd never realised how much your core, your stomach muscles were used to do pretty much everything. Every movement, getting out of a chair, walking, going upstairs, even taking a pee was painful, to the point where you would consider all of this when you're offered a cup of tea. If I say yes, then in a little while I'll have to get up out of this chair, which will be painful, and I'll then have to walk to the loo, which will be painful. I'll then have to have a pee, which will be painful, because all of it requires your core muscles. And for me, they'd all been cut in half during this operation. I was supposed to be trying to walk as much as possible, and in the first week or 10 days, all I could manage was one lap around our patio. After 2 weeks or so, I managed to get to the end of our street, which is about 300 metres. And then after 4 or 5 weeks, I could do a short lap around the neighbourhood, which was about 1 kilometre or so. And I could do that twice a day. For the first 4 weeks, the community nurses came to clean, pack and redress the hole in my stomach, which was very, very slowly closing and healing. From weeks 5 to 6, I had to go to my GP surgery for the nurses there to dress the wound till it was completely healed. It took 6 weeks at home to heal properly, and after the 3 weeks in hospital meant a lot of time had passed. And all this time, the cancer was continuing to grow on my liver. My last chemo cycle was the 21st of April, and following the complications of the cardioversion and having to have an emergency operation after my initial surgery, it extended the period of recovery, and it was now the beginning of September. Over 4 months had passed since my last chemo. I then met with my oncologist, who said that the liver team were ready to do the liver resection and take the cancer from there. So we began preparing. I met the surgeon and he was all set to go. He asked if he could operate in 5 days' time, but Hazel and I were collecting our new motorhome from Scotland, so he agreed to do it the following week. However, between that conversation and Hazel and I travelling to Scotland, I had an MRI booked, which I went to and thought very little more about it, but I should have remembered the cancer patient's mantra: the plan is only as good as your last scan. On Friday, as we were travelling back from Scotland in our new motorhome, we stopped at a campsite in Derbyshire. We set up camp, we decided to go for a walk and chat about the forthcoming surgery planned for the following Wednesday. As we walked and talked, my phone rang and it was the liver surgeon. He called to explain that he had caught sight of my latest MRI, and the cancer lesions on my liver had grown to a point over the past 4 months with no chemo. And so he reassured me that it was technically possible to operate now, but he would be happier to do it after another round of chemo, which would shrink the cancer and increase the possibility of a successful outcome. He explained that he had spoken to my oncologist and they were preparing for a further 3 months of chemo, after which he was confident that he could operate and remove the cancer. When I arrived home, I received a call from my Macmillan nurse regarding the date to come and meet with my consultant oncologist to discuss this next round of chemo. What can I say about the Macmillan nurses other than they are truly amazing? I cannot praise them enough. They're always there. They quickly reply to phone calls, messages and emails. They come and see you whenever you're receiving infusions, sometimes just to say hi and see how you're doing, or if there's anything you need. I cannot say enough good things about them. So my Macmillan nurse set up that meeting for a couple of days, and I was then able to have quite an extensive discussion with my oncologist, as she did not want to put me back on Folfox chemo, which I'd had before, due to the problems with my heart that I'd experienced when I was on that. And so I wasn't wanting to go back on it either. We discussed the issues with the 5FU drug and how having that had sent my heart into atrial fibrillation, or AF. However, she also explained that the 5FU was the foundation of all bowel cancer treatment, so it would not be possible to remove it from my chemo regime entirely. So the plan that we came up with, I say we, but of course the oncologist came up with, I just agreed. The plan was to change the regime from Folfox to Capox. Capox is a combination of oxaliplatin, which I'd had before, but the 5FU element was given in tablet form, in which my consultant believed would be metabolized differently, which she hoped would stop the same heart issues that I'd had before. There were no guarantees, but no other choices either, and so we agreed to proceed with the Capox. This round of chemo would be for 3 months, but it would be on a 3-week cycle. I would go in for the IV oxaliplatin, and then for the next 2 weeks I would take oral 5FU drugs, then have a week off before we did it all again. This round would only have been 4 cycles, but as I found out, the accumulative effect of the chemo would be brutal. The first cycle of Capox went okay. I had the usual side effects of oxaliplatin. I was sensitive to the cold and would get pins and needles in my hands and arms and feet if I touched anything cold. However, this time I was getting diarrhea as a side effect too. It was not too bad, but a challenge with a colostomy bag. After the second cycle, the accumulative effect of the 5FU began to impact me. I was getting very fatigued and extremely tired all of the time. I needed a nap during the day and sometimes could not really concentrate at all. I was in that sort of sleep deprived state. But I was sleeping for hours longer than I normally would. By the third cycle, the accumulative effect of these drugs were huge. I was sleeping for more than 15 hours a day. I would get up at 7 a.m. when I had to take the chemo drugs, and then by 10:30 a.m. I was so exhausted that I would go back to bed until maybe 12:30. I would then have lunch, take some more tablets, and then maybe watch some TV. But by 3 p.m. I would be so tired that I'd have to go back to bed for a few hours or so. I would then get up around 5:30 when Hazel, my wife, got in from work. We'd eat together. Then I'd take loads more chemo drugs. We watched some TV, and then about 9 p.m, sometimes earlier, I would go to bed and repeat the whole thing the next day and the next day and the next. It was so frustrating and annoying, but the peace that I spoke of earlier never left me. Even though I thought I was once more walking through this valley of the shadow of death, I feared nothing. God's peace was with me every day. I don't know about you, but I think it's easier to endure difficulty if you see that progress is being made. And after my second cycle of Capox, I went to have another MRI and CT scan. Knowing that the plan is only as good as the last scan, I was waiting with interest as to what the outcome would be. Whilst the plan was that after this round of chemo, I would have liver surgery, this scan would determine if it would remain the plan. It would tell us if the Capox had worked, and it had, although not as well as the Folfox, but it had worked. The tumours had all shrunk, and I still had one more cycle of chemo to go. So in theory, the result should only get better. As a result of these scans, I was booked in for a liver resection. The earliest I could have a general anaesthetic was 4 weeks after my last chemo tablet. And so once more we prayed that things would happen quickly, and they did. I was given an appointment with the consultant liver surgeon and booked in for a pre-op exactly 4 weeks after my last tablet. It really couldn't have happened any faster.